Morning. Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, broadcasting to you live from your nation's capital. We've got a lot to go through today, and we've got lots more for the week. So I'll be back in a couple of mere moments to explain what's going on here.
The Prime Minister lied, and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change, but we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station and subscribe. If you haven't, we're still trying to get to 61,000, and I think we'll get there with your help. Now, I want to talk about a report before we get into the real information, what's really going on with these wildfires and what the governments are not telling you. I want to briefly talk about a report here. Now, this is incredible because everywhere you read, even the Toronto Star now is saying Mark Carney's not the same Mark Carney. He's really not focused on climate change and net zero. Well, folks, he is. He very, very definitely is. And if you read through this 2030 emissions reduction plan, clean air, strong economy, it's got nothing to do with clean air because carbon, of course, is not a pollution. And it's going to mean a weaker economy. I encourage you to read through this because it's the same old Mark Carney, because this is a government document that's been untouched since Mark Carney became prime minister. And it's absolutely, you can read this for yourself on the internet. It's available, and I want to show you who has done some research on this. This is quite interesting here. Now, Kirk Lubinoff. Now, he's got a few weird things on his website here, but here's the point. The Liberal federal government's emissions reduction plan and its emission cap on the oil and gas industry is going to cost Alberta billions. Actually, it's going to cost them $1 trillion. Alberta will lose almost $1 trillion in economic activity between 2030 and 2050. Smaller GDP, decline in household disposable income. So it's all there. Employment loss. I think he meant losses. Provincial revenues down. Total disaster for Alberta. Reminder, what's bad for Alberta is also bad for Canada, because Alberta, as long as it remains in Canada, is the economic engine of this country. The oil and gas industry produces the largest share of the GDP. We have to remember that. Some people just hate the oil and gas industry, but that's what's keeping Canada running. So I encourage you to go through this. If you think Mark Carney is a different Mark Carney, it's what I have told you repeatedly. Mark Carney is the Mark Carney of the hour. Whatever Mark Carney has to say or do to get elected or to get approval from Canadians, he will say or do. And right now he's talking pipelines, he's talking economic growth, he's talking, we're going to do great things here with energy. Yeah, we'll have clean energy, but I'm not opposed to that fossil fuels anymore. Here, read the government reports, because that's really all that matters. That's where they put what they're going to do into black and white and color in terms of what this government stands for. Now, I want to talk also today again about this farce that's going on in the Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. I'm surprised PEI hasn't jumped on board yet, because, of course, PEI is one of the most liberal provinces. And so here's an interesting point. Can you remember back to 1989? Well, I can. We never talked about climate change in 1989. It might have been something the Club of Rome talked about, or the Bilderberg saying, hey, how can we control people in the future? Well, get them terrified about global warming, because that's what it was in the beginning. Recall, folks, it wasn't called climate change because that was too nebulous. It was called global warming because everyone said, oh, the temperatures are rising. But as soon as that didn't look like it was actually happening, the term became climate change. And so why didn't Canadians need climate lockdowns when they had 12,000 wildfires ranging in 1989? That's a lot higher than today. The highest ever recorded in Canada by far. Now think about this. Nobody said, hey, there must be some nefarious reason for these wildfires. It's got something to do with climate change. And now, of course, all we hear is that the wildfires that are burning right now, largely in Atlantic Canada. You don't hear anything about Alberta this year. Remember last year, Alberta was the scene of climate change in action. And you see the mainstream media constantly say, this is the new normal. Well, if that's the new normal, it's a lot more it's a lot more normal than it was in 1989, 36 years ago. Absolutely fascinating. And so in Nova Scotia, agencies issued 10 tickets worth more than 25,000 each to people allegedly violating Byrne restrictions. So that's how it started in Nova Scotia. So, and a lot of people have said, hey, Newfoundland and Labrador, it's just about the Byrne. Yes, so far, until John Hogan, Premier John Hogan, jumps on the climate change bandwagon and says, hey, we have got to stop people from hiking in the woods, walking in even going past the yellow tape. That's got to change. So that's, of course, where it started in Nova Scotia. From Tim Houston, conservative Premier Tim Houston. Of course, he's a conservative in the same boat as Doug Ford, meaning not really, faux conservative red Tory. So here it is. Nova Scotia has issued more than 288,000 in Byrne ban fines. So what was this about? Obviously, because 10 people got tickets, the premier decided to punish the whole province. And that's where it went from burning restrictions to hiking restrictions. And I tell you, people don't believe this around the world. But Canada, once again, is taking the lead in insanity. And that's the only way I can describe this. Now, what is causing all of these wildfires? Now, I was thinking this morning, one of the causes of fires one of the huge causes of fire used to be cigarettes, cigars, especially in the home, but also outside. People would leave a lit cigarette, would drop a lit cigarette on a path, and it would start a fire. With about 20% of the population smoking now on a regular basis anyway, I would say that's hardly going to be a major cause of anything. And if you look at the causes, in 2007 to 2023, 1,144 cases of arson, number one cause of fires. In a Nova Scotia, this is the Nova Scotia report. Are you reading me here? Arson, 46 cases of lightning. But interestingly enough, even though there's been 46 cases of lightning, that doesn't seem to figure. Because here's the Nova Scotia government disconnecting with itself. And by the way, we took your advice seriously here when you said you want more research. We'll do more research. And thank you for the advice. Lightning figures in 0% in this same Nova Scotia government report. I thought it was 46. Doesn't that add up to at least 1%? Probably 10% or more? No, it's 0% because there's such a madness amongst governments to blame every wildfire on climate change. Why? Well, because it's part of the narrative. And it's an opportunity to say, oh, if we don't, if you don't stop using fossil fuels, if you don't stop heating your home, freeze in the winter. Isn't it preferable to freeze in the winter than have a wildfire in your backyard? That's the mentality of these governments. When in fact, freezing in the winter will have absolutely no impact on whether or not there's a wildfire in your backyard or in your neighborhood or in your town or in your province. And this is their own statistics that demonstrate how crazy the statisticians are. They can't even admit. And here we are, forest fires and lightning. The federal government report, 51% of the total, 45% of all fires. The federal government even acknowledges that lightning might have something to do with wildfires. But they never mention that when they talk about, well, we can see what these wildfires mean for Canada. So clearly, it's going to mean successive years of wildfires increasing in intensity, getting worse, impacting more Canadians, and it's all because of climate change. And their own reports are suggesting otherwise. It's arson and lightning. Now, Marty up north, always helpful. Annual forest fires have been trending down for 40 years in Canada. Trending down. Now, just a minute, folks. If they've been trending down, why are we being told that it's getting worse and it's going to continue to get worse because of climate change? And that you can look forward to all of this horrendous spate of wildfires getting worse every year. And the statistics say that. And despite the fact that we've doubled our population, authorities are reporting every imaginable fires, even the ones in campgrounds. So that's, you're going to start a fire in your campground? Hey, that could be a forest fire. That's how crazy it is. And guess what, folks? Remember last year, it was Alberta's fault? Oh, Alberta, the home of all those fossil fuel production, the home of oil and gas. Alberta's getting its just desserts with those wildfires because it doesn't take this seriously. Nary a mention of wildfires in Alberta this summer because there haven't been any. They've been getting rain. And I guess that seems to have satiated these wildfires that were generated supposedly by climate change. And thank you again to Marty up north for that. Now, how is the federal government, how are provincial governments responding to this so-called crisis in wildfire? What are they doing? Well, this is absolutely fascinating. The only funding that has increased has been in Alberta and Ontario. Funding hasn't increased anywhere else. So if this is such a crisis, why are they not allocating funding towards solving the problem? Because they seem to think it's nothing more than a tool to promote what climate change agenda. And this, I think, shocks me more than anything else that I'm showing you today. This is absolutely horrendous. But this is where we are at in this country because people don't believe government agencies, government spokespeople don't even believe what they're telling you because they know it's politics. And this is what it comes down to. And yes, are homes being devastated, burned up by wildfire? Are people dying in some cases? Are people being injured? Are businesses being destroyed? Are livelihoods being destroyed? Yes. So you would think the government would do something in response to that. But here's what I'm telling you today. The governments are using the wildfire crisis to justify their own idiocy. Now, what does this all come down to? Woke politics? Yes. But I saw an interpretation the other day of what DEI really means. And of course, what the governments will tell you DEI means is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is code, of course, for identity politics and essentially, in many cases, racist politics, because it divides people amongst gender, ethnicity, race, and creates artificial boundaries, creates arbitrary distinctions between people. And this is why Donald Trump is crushing DEI and saying it's not going to have a place in government. And if it has a place in your university, you're not getting funding. If you expect us to support you as a government, get rid of your DEI policies because they're bogus. They're idiots. DEI really means deflection, evasion, and incompetence. That's what DEI promotes, and that's what DEI is all about. And remember that the next time somebody says to you, oh, don't you support DEI policies? Don't you realize they're about making it more equitable for people? Tell them it's about deflection, it's about evasion, and it's about incompetence. Here, I showed you that. Now, here's the last plank in our study of the wildfire phenomena and what it really means. Here's the exposed part. Federal government so concerned about wildfires. Oh, they're going to get worse. They're going to make life miserable for Canadians. They're going to be a fact of life from now on. And as we saw, they were worse 36 years ago than they are now. Somehow we got through it then without blaming this phenomena. How many firefighting aircraft? These are water bombers. And and being in the Air Force, we used to have an air show at Comox every other summer. And I think the last one I was involved with was 1997 or 98. Could have even been 99 actually. And we used to have a water bomber fly over and it would drop its load on the grass surrounding the runway, and people would just be in awe. So how many water bombers do you think the federal government has? Zero. How about BC? BC should be concerned about all of its green growth. And no, zero. Ontario and Alberta, once again, are leading the country in firefighting aircraft, just as they were in funding to combat wildfires. Huh. Alberta has 18, Ontario has 20, Saskatchewan has 17. Nova Scotia, 4. New Brunswick, 12. And I'm missing Newfoundland, Labrador. Where are you here? Oh, yeah. 0. So Newfoundland, Labrador has 0 of these things. So that's the state of affairs here with how governments really consider wildfires to be a clear and present danger, an existential threat to Canadians. What they really consider wildfires to be is a justification for climate change policies. for net zero policies. That's how they use wildfires. And I think that is not only dishonest, it's potentially bordering on criminal, because they were allowing wildfires to get worse, and the worse they get, the more they can say, we were right. This is all about climate change. A couple of other things to discuss in the show here. Thank you so much. And please share this broadcast right now with your friends and family. And I was just reminded we're well over 61,000 subscribers. closing in on 65,000. So thank you for all your support. Sometimes I miss that. But you recall, after the federal conservatives lost the federal election to the Liberals and Mark Carney, there were calls from the Conservative caucus to get rid of Jenni Byrne, who was the campaign manager for Pierre Poilievre and had been the campaign manager in the very unsuccessful Stephen Harper campaign of 2015, which I think was essentially a botched campaign. Harper could have won that campaign, and we probably would have at least had 4 years less of Justin Trudeau. But so what's Jenni Byrne up to? Well, she's still there. And Pierre Poilievre and her have been very close over the years. I'm not going to get into that side of it, but they've been very close over the years. And she's been a key advisor to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party for a long time. And I remember when I was running for a Canadian Alliance nomination. Yes, I was involved in politics in those days. I no longer am. I remember being interviewed by Jenni Byrne at that time. But what's she up to?
I am going to, as I said, stay on as an advisor. I am now. I, of course, advise Pierre. I speak to people on a daily basis, and I'm going to continue to do that. But I've stepped back from the day to day, and I'm not going to run the next campaign.
Rachel Siegel did the interview. She is a host of Beyond a Ballot podcast.
All right, well, listen to a bit of this. I think that's great news that she's not going to be running the next election.
And she joins us now. Rachel, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. What was your big takeaway from this interview?
I think for me, the really big part of this conversation with Jenni Byrne was the fact that she was so open. I had done background research on Jenni and realized that the biggest part of the equation, her voice, was really missing from the national narrative. And so I went into the interview with two goals. One was to really get who Jenni Byrne is. What does she like to do? How does she think? What are her values? But also to really dissect the last campaign, because that was a historic campaign, especially for the Conservatives. We saw the Conservatives go from a 22-point lead to losing government, and she was behind that campaign. And so I really wanted to know how she's feeling a couple of months out, whether or not she had regrets, whether or not she still stood behind some of the decisions that she had made during that time. And ultimately, I think what was most surprising is the fact that she answered absolutely everything. There was not one thing that she didn't completely dive into, including her thought processes, anything that she had regretted. And so I thought, after leaving that conversation, I thought that was pretty cool. And it was pretty cool to have that on the historical record for the country.
And Jenni Byrne made news in this interview telling you that she will not run the next Conservative election campaign. There has been some internal party fighting about that big lead that the party lost in the end. I'm curious, what do you think her announcement that she will not run the next campaign, what does that mean for Pierre Poilievre?
For Pierre, I think it means that, he will continue on the path that he has been on. And one of the interesting parts of the conversation that I had with Jenni was the fact that she realized very early on that Pierre had this momentum behind him. She talks about it as the COVID voter, this new Conservative coalition, the people that were coming out of their parents' basements to go to Pierre Poilievre rallies across the country, the woman who...
Yes, and arguably Jenni Byrne helped destroy that lead, because Pierre Poilievre was not really allowed this talk like Pierre Poilievre during the election campaign. I've said this repeatedly over the past couple of months. And I think if Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservative Party in the next federal election, I think he will do a lot better talking like Pierre Poilievre when somebody isn't whispering in his ear saying, Pierre, say it this way. Pierre, don't talk about the World Economic Forum. Pierre, don't talk about the World Health Organization and the pandemic treaty we signed. Pierre, don't talk about Tamara Leach and Chris Barber and how unjust it is that they have gone through lawfare. And don't talk about anything that might be seen as attacking globalism or enunciating and articulating the real values and issues of the grassroots conservative. Don't talk about that. Talk about anything else. And I think it's going to be a great thing for Pierre Poilievre in the next election. Now, if you want to watch the interview, I'm not going to put that on, but I think you might be, if you're really interested in the saga of Jenni Byrne, that might be the interview for you. But I just wanted to mention that because I think finally, I don't know if it was her, I think it was probably just her decision. I don't think there was any pressure from Pierre Poilievre. And I think the caucus really was irrelevant to her in the end. I don't think she really cared. It was about what she wanted to do, always has been. And she made a decision to step back because probably she's seen that and done that. And it's time to move on. Now, in the time remaining, I want to talk about, I think, what is probably the biggest issue concerning the world. And that's the Alaska summit, Friday, day after tomorrow, between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is going to be an historic summit. And of course, NATO and the European Union are already lining up behind Ukraine saying, don't give anything away. Like it's Donald Trump can't give anything away. It's not his to give away. But I think this is Donald Trump's last chance to continue to say that it's Biden's war, not mine, and that I'm a peace president. I was elected to negotiate peace around the world, not start foreign wars. MAGA was all about getting the United States extricated from foreign wars. Stop spending tens, hundreds of billions of dollars destroying other countries around the world and having U.S. servicemen and women killed in combat for what? Because none of these wars have turned out well. In every case, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, the situation is worse now than it was before the United States got involved. As I've said repeatedly over the years, I used to justify and approve of every U.S. war because I thought either they were fighting communism or they were fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. And I finally realized one day, in many cases, they were fighting to keep the military-industrial establishment rich. And that's exactly what's happened. Let's listen to Donald Trump talk about this coming summit.
So this is really a feel-out meeting a little bit. And President Putin invited me to get involved. He wants to get involved. I believe he wants to get it over with. Now, I've said that a few times, and I've been disappointed because I'd have like a great call with him, and then missiles would be lobbed into Kiev or some other place, and you'd have 60 people laying on a road dying. I said, that's cold, but it's a violent war. 5,000 to 7,000 people a week are dying. And you know, there's nobody from here. They're all Russian and Ukrainian people, and some people from the cities, much smaller number, but still, those missiles do damage and they kill a lot of people, but mostly soldiers.
And of course, you know, rhinos like Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, Republican in name only, senator from South Carolina, said, hey, that's the great thing about this war, is it's just Ukrainians dying. Oh, we just supply the weapons. Ukrainians can do all the dying. And of course, that's not only ghoulish, It's absolutely insane because the Ukrainians have withered their population down to the point through war deaths that are anywhere from 1.5 million to 2 million deaths on the battlefield. These are First World War casualties. These are First World War fatality figures. And there's also been a huge departure from the country. People are emigrating, leaving the country in droves. It's a shell of a country. And it's one reason this war has got to end.
And they're young soldiers, although in the case of Ukraine, they're getting much older. They're drafting 60-year-olds now. It's a terrible thing to witness.
65-year-olds and 16-year-olds and people with Down syndrome. When a country has to draft people off the street, and that's how they Shanghai them, like the Royal Navy used to do. They Shanghai people off the street, stuff them in the trucks, put them in uniform, and put them in the front line, and they're probably dead within 24 hours. No training, nothing. It's insane. And if you don't think this war is a farce, think about that. Volodymyr Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, is a dictator. He's corrupt. He's lining his pockets with Canadian money, US money, European money. He's delusional to think he could ever have won this war, or that he can now. He's delusional to think this is about freedom in Ukraine because he's a dictator who's imprisoned his political enemies, attacked the Christian churches, and leads the most corrupt state in Europe. And no country can sacrifice its teenagers and its old men and somehow suggest it's doing this for freedom.
Yes, and I think I have an obligation. Look, this is Joe Biden's war. This is not my war. I made a deal with NATO a month ago. You covered it very accurately, actually. We don't pay anything anymore. You know, we're not paying anything. They are buying things from us, and NATO is paying us. I got it raised from 2% of GDP to 5%. And they're paying us for everything that we send. We're not paying. But Biden approved $350 billion. Europe has spent $100 billion. The money that's been spent.
And, you know, somebody suggested to me, all the money, the billions that we have sent to Ukraine could have been used to buy some water bombers. Might have had a better purpose for the country, because all we've done is kept that war going. And Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, yes, and even Pierre Poilievre, they've all been in the same boat, marching lockstep on this. Keep the war going because it's about freedom, and it's not about freedom. It's about Ukraine insisting upon being a part of NATO, which should never have even been considered. NATO should not even be around as an organization anymore. It's past its due date. It's redundant. It is just there to keep the people in power well nourished with money. And NATO has ceased to be an organization with a rational objective. And Trump, having NATO give these weapons to Ukraine makes more economic sense for the United States, but it makes no political or military sense because it could still lead to the Third World War. And I think Trump gets to that.
It's a violent war. 5,000 to 7,000 people a week are dying. And you know, there's nobody from here. They're all Russian and Ukrainian people, and some people from the cities, much smaller number, but still, those missiles do damage and they kill a lot of people, but mostly soldiers. And they're young soldiers, although in the case of Ukraine, they're getting much older. They're drafting 60-year-olds now. It's a terrible thing to witness, and I think I have an obligation. Look, this is Joe Biden's war. This is not my war. I made a deal with NATO a month ago. You covered it very accurately, actually. We don't pay anything anymore. You know, we're not paying anything. They are buying things from us, and NATO is paying us. I got it raised from 2% of GDP to 5%. And they're paying us for everything that we send. We're not paying. But Biden approved $350 billion. Europe has spent $100 billion. The money that's been spent and the death is incredible. It's the worst thing that's happened, by far the worst that's happened since World War II. So I'm going in to speak to Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to be telling him, you got to end this war, you got to end it. And he wasn't going to mess with me. This war would have never happened. You know, we had a discussion about it one time, and we never had that discussion again. Would have never happened. And when the election was rigged, and then Biden took office, which was barely took office, the auto pen took office, bad things started happening. Bad things, stupid things were said. And it ended up in a war. And you know, and I don't believe this will happen anymore because I have that pretty well covered. This could end up in a third world war. This could have been a third world war. I don't think that's going to happen now.
That's probably the most important thing Trump says here. And by the way, whether Trump has been president or not, unless Trump had come down on NATO and said, Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, and we have to enunciate it. Yes, he could have stopped this from becoming a war. That's what broke the camel's back, was NATO's insistence that Ukraine become a member. After NATO had promised the imploding Soviet Union not 1 inch eastward. And of course, they broke that promise very quickly after and started expanding throughout Eastern Europe, to that literally planning to expand to the doorstep of Russia. And of course, that was unacceptable. Just as it was unacceptable for the Soviet Union to have missiles in Cuba in 1962. That was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to make Ukraine a member of NATO so it could be a place for NATO missiles. And Donald Trump might have been able to stop this war before it started if he had come down hard and fast on that. But what he says about the Third World War, yes, we are 89 seconds away from midnight on the Doomsday clock. I looked this up yesterday. That is a much shorter period of time than it was in 1962, where it was over 2 minutes in 1962. Actually, I think it was 5 minutes to midnight. But in 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's now 89 seconds to midnight because NATO encroaches upon Russian territory every day. And this could easily become a nuclear conflict if the wrong order is issued, if there's confusion, if somebody does something not exactly as they were told to do, if NATO sends troops into Russia. This could easily become a third world war. And I think that's why, as flawed as Donald Trump is and what he's saying here, he's right, because at least he cares about not making this into a third world war. Joe Biden talked about it a couple of times, but obviously wasn't all there. But the American administration, the UK administration under Keir Starmer, the French administration under President Emmanuel Macron, they are insane to suggest, well, if the US gives up on Ukraine, we're going to invade Russia. The UK has more admirals than battleships, more horses than tanks, an air force that can't fly because half of its planes are not operational. And it is in no position to fight Russia any more than France is. And the people of Europe don't want a nuclear war or even a war with Russia. And I'm sick of the mainstream media trumpeting the propaganda of the militarists and the military industrial establishment who want this war because it's going to mean more money in their coffers. It does every time. That's what wars are all about. In the end, most of them are about people making money off of killing people en masse. It's certainly been about that ever since industrialized warfare came into being. You could say that began with the U.S. Civil War, but it became tremendously dominant during the Great War of 1914-1918. That was an industrialized conflict that made billions of dollars for people selling armaments. And they didn't let the deaths of millions, the privation of millions in trenches, being eaten by rats and living in stench and mud. That didn't bother them because it was all about making money. Let's listen to a bit more, Trump. Sorry,
but I thought it was very respectful of Russia is coming to our country as opposed to us going to his country or even a third party place. But I think we'll have constructive conversations. Then after that meeting, immediately, maybe as I'm flying out, maybe as I'm leaving the room, I'll be calling the European leaders who I get along with very well. And, I have a great relationship, I think, with all of them. And I get along with Zelensky, but, I disagree with what he's done. Very, very severely disagree. This is a war that should have never happened, wouldn't have happened. But I'll be speaking to Zelensky. The next meeting will be with Zelensky and Putin, or Zelensky and Putin and me. I'll be there if they need. But I want to have a meeting set up between the two leaders. I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying, well, I have to get constitutional approval. I mean, he's got approval to go into war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody.
And Trump is finally being realistic about this. That Russia is not going to vacate the Donbass region, the eastern provinces. And they're going to keep those. And Russia is going to insist that Ukraine never become a member of NATO. As long as NATO exists. I don't think that's going to be for much longer. But Donald Trump's being realistic, and I think Donald Trump can actually do some good here for world peace. And we'll be watching that summit very carefully. And I think this might be the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine. Thank God for everybody, especially those Ukrainians who are dying en masse for a corrupt president who is lining his pockets with the money that has been given to him that he has begged and pleaded for around the world. I'll be back in a minute with some concluding remarks. Yes, join me tomorrow. I'll have on Marty Moore of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. We'll be talking about the hiking ban. We'll be talking about the lack of freedom of religion in Canada, as illustrated by the visit of Sean Fute a couple of weeks ago. And we'll be talking about how mired the Canadian government has become in minutia that takes away, that steals our freedom. On Friday, I've got the parents of Josh Alexander. You might remember Josh. He's the guy that got kicked out of an Ottawa school for opposing their transgender bathroom policy. His parents have both lost their jobs because they refused to participate in Pride Month. Unbelievable. Josh Alexander's dad will be on the show. And I'm hoping his mom can come as well, but his dad will be here at the very least. Going to be a fascinating interview. And I'm having trouble with my mouse today. Thank you so much, folks, for joining me today. This has been David Krayden broadcasting to you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Always a pleasure to have you on board. I'll be back again tomorrow. Godspeed to all of you. God bless this country, and we'll see you again tomorrow.